A really big factor that influences the political behavior of members of Congress and presidential candidates and presidents is the structure of the electoral system itself. Because you get to have office and you get to win re-election by winning the most votes in a specific election. Whatever the particular political or partisan environment is, whatever party you belong to and wherever in its history it happens to be, your task as a candidate is to get the most votes. And the electoral system actually has a big impact on how you go about getting the most votes. It's not just a matter of getting the most votes, it's a matter of what do you do to get the most votes, not just abstractly, but from the people who do vote. Now, one of the things to note at the beginning is that campaigns can seem very much like they're about persuasion. They're about manipulation. They're about getting your message across, having your message succeed with voters to get them to want to vote for you. And that's not unimportant, but probably the bigger factor, at least equal, and I think I feel personally more important, is actually getting your voters to the polls. Having your core constituency come out, be excited enough to vote, be excited enough to actually talk to people who maybe might or might not vote and influence them to come vote. The ground game, the so-called ground game, the get out the vote effort is key to winning elections. And I think that we're seeing in the last couple elections, the last few, say, in the last 6 to 8 years, that that's getting more attention in the mainstream kind of coverage of politics. But it's always been true that getting out the vote, the ground game, making sure your supporters show up in greater numbers is super important. That's getting even more true as persuadable voters are kind of dwindling in number. And this ebbs and flows. Like the number of persuadable voters rises and falls depending on all kinds of changes. We're at a moment right now where the number of persuadable voters is actually maybe relatively small. I see that probably getting larger at some point in the future and getting smaller again, and that's going to expand and contract. That's part of the broader political landscape. Who is persuadable and how many of those persuadable people are there and what persuades them. That's obviously an important component of campaigns, but the political behavior that's influenced by the structure of elections, in this particular lecture I'm going to look at the structure of congressional elections, and in the next one the structure of the Electoral College for presidential elections. The structure of the elections really has a very powerful impact on how it is that candidates behave. Now, want to note a few distinctions right up front in terms of the structure of the election. There are two different types of congressional elections. There are Senate elections, which are statewide, and the size of the electorate varies from the very smallest states like Alaska and Wyoming to the very largest states like New York, Texas, and California. The senators are all running in the same abstract kind of landscape, but really every state is different based on its size as well as its heterogeneity. There are some states that are medium-sized and diverse enough that a Democrat or a Republican has a fair shot. There are some states that are very large where the Republican and the Democrat has almost no chance at all. There are small states that are similar. So there are safe and swing states, and there are states that vary in size. One of the things that's true, though, about all states, except for the very most marginal cases, is that a state itself, a whole state, tends to be far more diverse than a single congressional district. Members of the House run in a congressional district that is equal sized roughly to all other congressional districts. A congressional district tends to be, because it is bounded by a territory that's not a historical boundary of a state, but is bounded by the redistricting process, tends to be more homogeneous. Even the most diverse, ethnically, racially, age and job category districts tend to be relatively politically homogeneous. Definitely compared to states, even compared to a safe state like North Carolina, which is actually this election trending towards not so safe anymore. A Senate election is going to be more up in the air than a typical House district, certainly in the state of North Carolina, but even nationwide. Now, so there are two distinctions there. One, Senate elections, which are statewide, and House elections, which are a single district of the same size. All of them are the same size. So people running for the House are all running in the same size district. Members of the Senate are running in vastly different sizes. If you're running for senator in Delaware, you have a very different task than if you're running for Senate in Texas in terms of the number of voters you're trying to reach. In the House of Representatives, it's the same size constituency. Now, voter turnout rates will be different in different districts, and the voter turnout rates will be different in different states. The partisan makeup will be different in different states and in different districts. So these are important factors which determine how candidates run. If you're running in a small state with a high turnout rate, then and it's a relatively diverse, small to medium-sized state with a high turnout rate, you're going to have a different type of campaign than if you're running in a large state with relatively low turnout that is safe in one direction or another. Ground game is going to be more important in one state versus another. Ground game is going to be more important in a congressional district that is more diverse than in one that's more homogeneous. So whether you're doing persuasion or get out the vote in which measure, like which is a bigger part of your campaign, is going to depend on the partisan nature, the size, the type, whether it's House or Senate, and the partisan lean of your particular district. Now, there's one other really important distinction in congressional elections that has always been a functional part of our congressional electoral system, or it's been for 150 years, and is now becoming more and more important, and that is the fact that our congressional election system is a two-tiered election. There's a primary election. Each of the parties holds a primary to decide who their general election candidate is going to be, and then there's a general election which pits the nominated Democrat against the nominated Republican. Now, this is not the only way to organize an election or to structure an election. And in fact, in the United States, we have a lot of nonpartisan elections. There are elections where it is a winner-take-all or a most votes, and it's not partisan. A lot of judicial elections, you're not even allowed to declare your party. There are primaries that are called jungle primaries, where basically the two candidates who get the most votes in the primary go to the general election. California, for its Senate races, recently adopted the jungle primary, and in the last couple of Senate elections in California, there have been two Democrats running against each other because the two Democrats got the most votes in the primary. But by far, even though there's diversity even in the congressional election system a little bit, and even though there is theoretical diversity in how democratic elections happen, and in the United States at the local level there are a lot of nonpartisan elections. Like in Portland, our city council elections are nonpartisan, because it would always be basically, if it was a Democrat running against a Republican, it would be a safe seat for the Democrat. But in our congressional election system, the vast norm, the most common election is a party primary in the spring or summer, followed by a general election that pits a Democrat against a Republican. Now, the two types of districts that there are, safe districts and swing districts, give a very different electoral landscape to candidates. In a safe district, either strongly Republican or strongly Democratic, the primary election is the election. Basically, if you're in a strongly Republican district and you win the Republican nomination, the general election is not going to be a problem for you. Now, that is, again, the norm. There are times where a safe Republican seat could have a competitive general election. That happens when there are, for example, a deeply flawed candidate, there's a scandal that pops up. This happened in Alabama's last special election for Senate, where the Republican was deeply flawed and the Democrat was able to win in what is traditionally a very safe red Senate seat. There was a Democrat elected. So there are exceptions to all the rules I'm going to lay out, or all of the generalizations. But in general, if you're in a safe seat, safe district or safe state, then you're going to be running in a primary election, and the general election, while you have to, win the most votes, and you still do have to campaign, and there's going to be stuff that you do, you're not going to be sweating the general election. Now, the number of safe seats is extraordinarily high. In fact, probably 4/5 on average of congressional elections or congressional seats are safe seats. Only about 100 to, in a really up in the air year, 120 of the 535 congressional seats are truly competitive. And that's a high number. In some years, they're not even that competitive. And it varies. What is a swing district that say leans Democratic. It's a Democratic-leaning swing district. In other words, either a Republican or a Democrat could win. With a long-serving Democratic incumbent, that theoretically swing district becomes safer and safer because of name recognition and because of the advantages of the incumbency. But, and here's the thing, and this has become more and more important, even if it's a safe district for that particular Democratic incumbent, that doesn't preclude a primary challenge. The fact that, and so I'm going to go back to talking only about safe districts right now because I want to get through that before I talk about swing districts. In a safe district, the primary election is the election for all intents and purposes. If you're the incumbent, your goal is to avoid a primary challenge, to avoid being, as the now people call it, being primaried. Now, 30, 40, 50 years ago, being primaried wasn't a major concern for incumbents as long as they essentially adhered to the basic ideological and behavioral norms of their particular party. In other words, if you were a decently loyal Democrat or a decently loyal Republican, I say decently because you could go your own way a certain amount of the time, but if you were decently loyal, then party leaders weren't going to threaten you with being primaried. And in fact, one of the ways that party leaders maintained unity in their caucus was with the theoretical possibility that they would drop their support for the incumbent in a safe seat and support a primary challenger, support somebody to overthrow. So you had to be relatively loyal. And again, you could depart and there was sort of room to move. You didn't have to be totally party line and always vote with what the party leaders wanted. But if you wanted to not be primaried, you had to basically just keep the party leaders not unsatisfied with you. That has changed a lot. In the past 30 years that's changed, and it's changed even more quickly in the post-Citizens United era. And I'll talk about the effect of Citizens United on party leaders in Module 2. But I will note right now that with Citizens United and the possibility of outside money flowing in vast quantities into any particular race quickly, the primary challenges can now come not just from party leaders dropping their support for an incumbent who's not sufficiently loyal, but can come from outside groups who don't like the ideological makeup of the incumbent and want somebody that is more in line, usually more extreme, more in line with their particular view. So, and what is actually happened is that increasingly outside groups are dissatisfied with incumbents who are too loyal to establishment, too in line with what party leaders want. Party leaders actually have lost a decent amount of control or a large amount of control over their caucus because incumbents are legitimately more afraid of the opposition of outside groups being primaried by somebody who has the support of a wealthy donor or super PAC. They're more likely to care about those groups maintaining their support for them than they are about either keeping the party leaders satisfied or avoiding pissing off the party leaders. So that's actually changed behavior because always in a safe seat, and in any seat really, you don't want to be primary, but in a safe seat, that's basically the only way you lose your seat in Congress is if you get primaried. The primary challenge used to only be driven by party insiders. Now it's driven more powerfully by party outsiders. And what that means is incumbents are now actually caught between two different powerful forces. Now, if roughly 4/5 of Congress is made up of safe seats, and increasingly outside groups have the ability to make incumbents sweat for being too establishment, for not being extreme enough, for not adhering to the most kind of powerful views of a small set of constituents that are supported by the super PAC money, then they're worried about being primaried. They also incumbents also have to worry about not essentially becoming disloyal party members. But of those two influences, increasingly incumbents realize the bigger danger to their remaining in their seat is outside groups and very ideologically extreme groups of constituents within their district. Now, under normal circumstances, this is a problem anyway because in primaries, who votes in a primary? Well, most states actually have open primaries where you're allowed, many states I should say, have open primaries where you're allowed to vote in either party's primary, whatever your registration is, and if you're not registered as a Democrat or a Republican, you're allowed to vote in either one, not both, but one or the other. Some very small number of states, Oregon is included in this list, have closed primaries where you actually have to be registered as a Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary. But the norm, though it's not an overwhelming norm, but the norm is that voters can vote in whichever primary they want. But typically, in terms of voter behavior, only Democrats are going to vote in Democratic primaries, and only Republicans are going to vote in Republican primaries, even though in many states, people from the other party and unaligned independents are allowed to vote in either primary. You're thinking about, of course, during the primary, you're not thinking about the electorate as a whole. You're thinking only about your party's voters. And typically, because voter turnout rates in primary elections are way below the norm for general elections, and general elections are actually relatively low, right? A historical high in my lifetime has been 66% voter turnout in the 2008 presidential election. And that's historically high since the era of sort of party dominance of the late 19th century, when voter turnout rates were in the 80 to 90% range for a presidential election. But 66% in a midterm election, 50% voter turnout is relatively common. In a primary election, in a non-presidential year, and even in presidential years, but in a non-presidential year, below 50% of the eligible voters are going to turn out to vote in a primary. Who turns out? Not just Democrats or Republicans, but the most committed Democrats and Republicans, the ones who are actually the most politically aware, the most politically active, and the ones who have the most at stake. Who are these voters? Typically now, those voters, and this has been true for, I would say, most of the history of the parties, but it's definitely even more true now. Typically, those voters are ideological extremes, right? So if you're a relatively moderate Republican in a safe Republican district, you might go vote in the primary election, but you're going to probably be outvoted by a very conservative Republican, by the block of very conservative Republicans. They're the ones who are motivated to vote. If you're a moderate Republican, you might not even turn out to vote in the primary at all, and if you do, you're still probably going to be outnumbered by the more strongly conservative, the more zealous, the more ideologically extreme voters. Political candidates know this, and in fact, not only do they know this, but they also know that since getting out the vote is a big part of campaigning. Persuasion is one thing, but getting out the vote is a really huge thing. Who's easier to motivate? Who's easier to get to the polls? People who are concerned and extreme, whose views can be activated much more quickly with persuasion, right? So a lot of persuasion in primaries is just persuasion to come out and vote. I'm a very, very conservative Republican running against a moderate Republican incumbent. Come out and vote for me. Like, don't even need to persuade you to think that I'm the better candidate. You'll know. My ideological brand will be clear. I don't have to persuade you that I'm the better candidate than another person. I need to persuade you to come out, to kick out the incumbent. And that is a much easier get out the vote effort than to convince an undecided moderate who doesn't really know if either candidate's going to do much for them, or they can't really tell the difference, to come vote in a general election. The get out the vote effort in a primary focused on more extremists is really powerful. And this is one of the reasons why outside money can have such a big influence, is because outside money can inundate the ad space, which makes these extremist party supporters aware of the fact that there is an alternative that's better than the incumbent, right? The stale, old, moderate Republican is now being outmaneuvered and outgunned by the more ideologically extreme conservative Republican. The same thing goes for the Democratic Party, only extreme liberal as opposed to extreme conservative. So for the bulk of congressional elections, one, the election is the primary, which has a way lower turnout rate. It has a partisan constituency, and even among that partisan constituency, the more likely voter, the easier to motivate, is going to be the extremist one. So what we get with a lot of safe seats is we get an increasingly polarized political class. One of the things that has shown up in the last decade, at least, if not 20 years, but definitely in the last decade, is that Congress is more polarized than the American people as a whole. And the reason for this is because the American people as a whole don't vote for Congress as a whole. The voters in a district or a state vote for their representative to Congress. And in the vast majority of seats, it's not even the voters in that district or state, it's the partisan voters. And it's not even the partisan voters, it's the most extreme partisan voters. So we end up getting a subset of the nation choosing the winner of primaries. And then that winner goes on to easily, except when there's scandal or something, some real serious way of election, goes on to easily win in the general election. So political candidates themselves, when they're running for office and then when they're in office, are aware of the fact that there is a narrow, aggressive, usually extreme, easily motivated to vote group of people who are watching them very carefully. And so that's who you're going to pay attention to, right? Ideally, when you get elected to Congress, you pay attention to all your constituents. But because you need to get reelected in order to be able to get anything done, if you want to be on an important committee, if you want to be the chair of that committee, if you need to get reelected multiple times to do that, you have to keep getting reelected. So you have to pay attention to the voters who are key for you. You have to fight off the possibility of an incumbent challenge. Like, you don't want to be primaried at all, but then if you are primaried, you want to be able to survive a primary. Now, this actually, in terms of political behavior, creates a very tricky environment for incumbents, because in order to get good committee assignments, in order to get committee chairs, you need to have the party leadership who doles these out be happy with you. But in order to make sure you're not primaried, or to survive a primary challenge if you are primaried, you need to make sure that these extremist outside groups are happy with you. So that creates a very treacherous, sort of conflict-ridden environment. And when push comes to shove, and if you're wondering, why did that person do that? I can't believe they did that. And they're being a total hypocrite. They said these things and now they're going against it. It's almost always because they are signaling towards and behaving towards and turning towards those ideologically extreme, highly motivated primary voters. So when you're baffled by the behavior of members of Congress, ask yourself, is it because that's who their real audience is? Not the nation as a whole, not their own conscience, not what seems to be principled or consistent, but that particular group of people. That group of people doesn't tend to mind hypocrisy if hypocrisy serves their interests, right? So Mitch McConnell right now is not probably too worried about people saying he's a hypocrite for rushing through a presidential nomination to the Supreme Court so close to an election when he obstructed one that was actually farther from an election, far farther from an election. People can say he's a hypocrite, he's unprincipled. Well, he's not looking at hypocrisy or principle or consistency, because the people who are looking at him, they care less about his consistency and more about him doing in this moment what they want. That Mitch McConnell is just one member of Congress. He's obviously very high profile and very powerful and influential, but his behavior in this way is consistent with and similar to the behavior of candidates. So when you see what you think is inconsistency or hypocrisy or baffling behavior, try to reference back to this fact of elected officials, the world they occupy. And in a lot of cases, it'll help make it make sense. It doesn't make it less maddening, but it makes it make sense to a certain degree. Now, the small group of, I would say, unlucky elected officials who represent swing states in the Senate or swing districts in the House of Representatives, they have also a treacherous path to walk, which is that you have to win a primary election among your party's voters and among partisans who tend to be more extreme, and you have to win a competitive general election. So you're a Democrat in a suburban swing district, and you're running against other Democrats, and you have to appeal to hardcore Democratic voters to get the nomination. Then you win it, and then you have to pivot for the general election and now appeal to moderate independent swing voters who exist in large numbers in these swing districts. So that's a difficult thing, and that often involves that kind of whiplash where we can see people being hypocritical, or where we can see them taking stands and then backing away from those stands. Or we can see just flat out personality politics instead of policy, because if you run on your personality, it's way easier to convince those two different electorates that you're a good person, that you're trustworthy, that you're going to work hard and be a good member of Congress, than it is to kind of take the right policy positions. So when you're running for a swing seat, you will tend to stay away from policy and more focus on personality and character. But you will also have to navigate a sort of a two-track system where you have to be extreme enough to win your primary, to ward off a primary challenge, and you have to be moderate enough and have a broad enough appeal to win in the general election. Now, once you're an incumbent, even in a swing district, your task is a little easier in the sense that the general election is going to be easier for you since you have name recognition, and if you just do a good job, most voters have a high approval rating for their member of Congress. Right? Congress as a whole has abysmal approval ratings. Traditionally, below 40%. In recent years, below 25%. At certain points, as low as 12 or 14% approval rating for Congress as an institution. Members of Congress themselves typically enjoy approval ratings from 60 to 95% in their district or in their state. And the reason why there's that disparity is that, again, voters don't vote for Congress. They vote for their specific member. You can look at Congress and say, they're a bunch of clowns, a bunch of idiots, they're not doing anything, and they're too polarized, and be dissatisfied with them. But you look at your member of Congress and say, doing a good job, serving the district, saying the right things, really a person of character and integrity. And even when they're hypocritical in a direction that I like because they're pivoting towards hypocritically a position that actually I can support. So voters in a district or state will tend to have a much higher approval rating for their member of Congress than they will for the institution of Congress as a whole. We don't vote for Congress as a whole. So when people talk about approval ratings and feelings about Congress and congressional polarization, the reason that can exist alongside of what most voters actually want, which is pragmatic, moderate, problem-solving people who don't necessarily just do what the party line says. We don't get those people because that kind of behavior doesn't typically win elections. It definitely doesn't win in in safe seats, and it doesn't win and it wins a little bit more in swing seats, but the swing seats are far outnumbered. And so when you're in Congress, let's say you're a moderate pragmatic, you're a Democrat who has a lot in common with moderate Republicans. You have no problem compromising or reaching across the aisle or coming up with a bipartisan solution. In fact, you think bipartisan solutions are among the best that there are. But you are surrounded by roughly, 4 out of 5 members of Congress are going to not see the world the way you do, because seeing the world the way you do would mean that they get voted out next time. They don't land back. Right? Here in Portland, my representative, and many of you probably is your representative as well, is Earl Blumenauer, one of the consistently most liberal, progressive members of the House of Representatives. If Earl were to try to work with Republicans more, to compromise, to vote for things that had bipartisan solutions, the backlash against him here in Portland would be swift and clear. And so even if he wanted to, and I don't know him personally, so I can't tell if he really wants to compromise or not, or be pragmatic, or reach across the aisle, but politically, to do so is practically political suicide. And that's true for 4 out of 5 members of Congress. So the political behavior, of course, is determined by what party leaders are doing, the nature of the party, the basic party brand, the coalition, the time. If the sense, like your party membership really matters when wave elections come around. If you're a popular Republican in a blue wave election in a swing district, you get swept away with the blue wave. If you're a popular Democratic incumbent in a swing district who's won re-election pretty easily even in that swing district year after year, in a red wave election, you get swept away. For the most part, the members of Congress are going to be looking at they're going to be looking at the core constituency of their party in their particular district. So their behavior is going to be oriented in that direction. I hope that this helps make sense of some political behavior that maybe sometimes is baffling and is maddening. I find it maddening sometimes too, but that maddening nature is tempered by the fact that I understand that the people who are behaving this way, the elected officials behaving this way, in a way, the structure of our electoral system, combined with our political demographics, that we have a ton of swing districts, safe districts, and only a few swing districts. Part of that is a result of gerrymandering, and much of that is just a result of natural political demographics. Given the structure of our electoral system, that maddening political behavior is completely sensible and understandable. Doesn't make it less maddening, but it makes it understandable.